The mountain wind howled through the towering pines with a ferocity that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth, sending cascades of snow spiraling through the air like ghostly dancers in the pale moonlight. Dorothy Smith collapsed against the rough-hewn porch of the remote cabin, her breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps that turned to thick white vapor in the bitter, bone-chilling cold that cut through her torn and inadequate clothing like invisible knives. Her swollen body, heavy with the child she carried, shook uncontrollably, not just from the freezing temperature that numbed her extremities and clouded her thoughts, but from the raw desperation and primal fear that had driven her up this treacherous, seemingly impossible path through wilderness that had tested every ounce of her remaining strength and determination. Snow clung to her torn and blood-stained dress like a shroud, accumulating in the folds of fabric that had once been fine cotton, but now hung in tatters around her trembling frame. Her bare feet were blue with cold, cut and bleeding profusely from the sharp rocks and frozen ground of the rocky trail she had climbed, in what she knew might be her final act of hope before death claimed both her and her unborn child. Each step up the mountain had been agony, each breath a struggle against the thin air and her own exhaustion. But something deeper than survival instinct had driven her forward through the darkness and cold. Henry Cooper stood in the doorway like a monument to solitude and strength, his massive frame silhouetted against the warm golden glow of the firelight that danced behind him, casting long shadows across the porch where this broken woman had somehow found the courage to seek sanctuary. His weathered face, marked by years of mountain living and the deep lines that spoke of both physical hardship and emotional pain, showed no emotion as he looked down at the woman who had somehow found her way to his isolated sanctuary, a place 20 miles from the nearest town, accessible only to those with the determination to brave the treacherous paths that wound through the unforgiving wilderness. She was clearly with child, her condition obvious and vulnerable even beneath the ragged layers of clothing that barely covered her trembling form and provided little protection against the elements that had tried to claim her life during her desperate journey. Her dark hair, once probably arranged with care and attention, now hung in matted strands around a face marked by exhaustion, fear, and the kind of desperation that comes only from having nowhere left to turn in a world that had systematically stripped away every option and every hope. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind that continued to howl around them like the voices of all the lost souls who had ever sought refuge in these mountains. "I have nowhere else to go. They threw me out of town, said I was a disgrace to decent people everywhere. I walked for 3 days and nights to find you, following stories and rumors, hoping against hope that the tales were true." Henry had heard the stories about himself that circulated through the valley below like whispered legends shared around fires on cold nights. The mountain man who had turned his back on civilization after losing everything that mattered in the war that had taken so many good men and left so many families broken and incomplete. A hermit who wanted nothing to do with the world that had taken his beloved family and left him with nothing but scars, bitter memories, and a heart that had learned to expect nothing but disappointment from his fellow human beings. But looking at this woman, this broken soul who had somehow summoned the strength and courage to climb his mountain when any reasonable person would have given up and accepted defeat, something stirred in his chest that he had thought long dead and buried beneath years of isolation and carefully cultivated indifference to the suffering of others. It was something that felt dangerously like compassion, mixed with recognition of a pain that matched his own. "You are done begging forever," he said quietly, his voice rough from disuse but carrying an authority that came from absolute certainty about what was right and necessary. And without another word or moment of hesitation, he bent down and lifted her into his arms as if she weighed nothing at all, as if her pregnant body and waterlogged clothing were no more burden than a child's doll. Her body went limp against his chest, and he could feel through her clothing how thin she had become despite her pregnancy, how the months of hardship had stripped away everything but the essential core of her being. As he carried her inside, the warmth of the cabin enveloped them both like a benediction, and Dorothy Smith felt safe for the first time in months, perhaps for the first time in her entire adult life. The sensation was so foreign and unexpected that tears began to flow down her cheeks, mixing relief with gratitude and the overwhelming realization that she might actually survive this ordeal that had nearly claimed her life. But how had she come to be here, collapsed on the porch of a man she had never met, begging for mercy from a stranger who lived like a ghost among the peaks, isolated from all human contact in society? The story began 6 months earlier, in what felt like another lifetime, when Dorothy had been a different woman entirely, living a different life in the valley below, surrounded by the comforts and securities that she had foolishly believed would always protect her from the harsh realities of the world. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you are watching from and hype this video in the comments. Dorothy had once been the wife of Thomas Smith, a successful merchant who owned the largest and most prosperous general store in Cedar Falls, a thriving community that served the needs of farmers, miners, and travelers throughout the region. She had lived in a fine two-story house on Main Street with white picket fences and flower gardens that were the envy of every other woman in town. She wore dresses made of silk and wool imported from back east, had servants to tend to her needs and maintain the household, and enjoyed all the privileges that came with being married to one of the most influential men in the territory. The townspeople respected her husband's wealth and position in the community, and by extension, they showed her the deference and courtesy due to a woman of standing and social importance. She had been content, if not entirely happy with her circumstances, believing that her comfortable life was all she could reasonably expect from marriage, and that the security it provided was worth the emotional distance that had always existed between her and Thomas. She had convinced herself that love was a luxury that practical people could not afford to pursue. The trouble began when Thomas started spending long evenings away from home, claiming that business required his attention in the neighboring towns and that his success depended on maintaining relationships with suppliers and customers throughout the territory. Dorothy had accepted his explanations without question, trusting in the man she had married and the life they had built together, never imagining that his absences might have anything to do with another woman, or that her comfortable world was built on foundations far more fragile than she had ever suspected. She busied herself with the household, tending to her garden where she grew vegetables and flowers, and participating in the social activities that filled the days of respectable wives in their small but growing community. She attended church socials, organized charity drives for the poor, and maintained the kind of social connections that were expected of a woman in her position. It was a life of routine and responsibility, but it had seemed stable and secure. It was not until she discovered she was carrying a child that the cracks in her marriage began to show with frightening clarity. When she shared the joyful news with Thomas, expecting celebration and tenderness, anticipating that this blessing might bring them closer together and give new meaning to their relationship, she instead found coldness and suspicion that chilled her to the bone. He questioned her about her activities, her visitors, demanded to know whose child she carried, and accused her of betraying their marriage vows with accusations that struck her like physical blows. The accusation hit her like a physical blow, and she realized with growing horror that her husband had been projecting his own unfaithfulness onto her, using his own guilt and deception to justify treating her with cruelty and suspicion. The arguments that followed revealed the truth about Thomas's absences, truths that shattered her understanding of their marriage and her place in the world. He had been keeping company with a woman in the next town, a widow named Rebecca Miller, who had captured his attention and his affection with promises of passion and excitement that his wife had apparently never provided. He no longer wanted the burden of a wife and child, especially not when he had convinced himself that the baby was not his, despite the obvious impossibility of Dorothy's having found time or opportunity for infidelity, given the closely watched life of a merchant's wife in a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business. Dorothy pleaded with him, swearing her faithfulness and begging him to remember the love they had once shared, or at least the respect and partnership that had sustained their marriage through its early years. But his heart had already turned to stone, hardened by his own guilt and his desire to justify the choices he had already made. The confrontation that would destroy her life came on a cold October morning when Dorothy was 4 months along in her pregnancy, her condition beginning to show despite her efforts to conceal it from the gossips and busybodies who made up the social fabric of their small town. Thomas had returned from another of his mysterious trips, and she could smell another woman's perfume on his clothes, a scent that was foreign and cloying, completely unlike anything she had ever worn. When she confronted him about it, gathering all her courage to demand the truth she already suspected, he exploded with a rage she had never seen before, a fury that seemed to transform him into someone she no longer recognized. He accused her of being a whore and a deceiver, of tricking him into marriage under false pretenses, of carrying another man's bastard child and trying to pass it off as his own legitimate heir. The words struck her like blows, each one carefully chosen and designed to wound and humiliate, to strip away every shred of dignity and self-respect she had ever possessed. She had never heard such language from him before, had never imagined that the man she had married was capable of such cruelty. "You want to know the truth?" he had shouted, his face twisted with a cruelty that made him almost unrecognizable as the man she had once trusted with her life and future. "I have been with Rebecca Miller for over a year. She is everything you are not, passionate, exciting, alive in ways you could never understand. She gives me what you never could, and I intend to marry her as soon as I am free of you and your lies. Take your bastard and get out of my house. You have until tomorrow morning to gather your things and disappear from my life forever." Dorothy had spent that night packing her few personal belongings, her hands shaking uncontrollably as she folded the clothes that would have to last her through the coming winter and beyond. She had some jewelry that her mother had left her, pieces that held sentimental value but might be sold if desperation required it, a small amount of money she had saved from household expenses over the years, and the rapidly fading hope that she could find work somewhere to support herself and her unborn child. She had never imagined that a woman of her standing could fall so far so quickly, or that the security she had taken for granted, it could be stripped away with such brutal efficiency. The next morning, Thomas made good on his threat with a thoroughness that spoke of careful planning. He had the sheriff escort her from the house, claiming publicly that she had been stealing from his store to support a lover, accusations that he knew would spread through the town like wildfire and make it impossible for her to find refuge anywhere in the community. The lie spread through Cedar Falls with the speed that only malicious gossip can achieve, and by noon everyone in town believed that Dorothy Smith was an adulteress, a thief, and a woman of loose morals who deserved whatever fate befell her. The women who had once invited her to their tea parties and social gatherings now crossed the street to avoid her, their faces set in expressions of righteous disgust and moral superiority. The men looked at her with a mixture of disgust and predatory interest, seeing her as a fallen woman who might be available for their own purposes, someone who had forfeited the protection that society offered to respectable wives and mothers. Children were warned to stay away from her, as if her supposed sins might be contagious. Dorothy had tried to find lodging at the boarding house, offering to pay in advance for a room where she could stay until she figured out her next move. But the proprietor refused her money, claiming that her presence would drive away respectable customers and damage his reputation in the community. She had gone to the church, hoping that Christian charity might provide her with shelter and guidance. But the minister had turned her away after a brief and uncomfortable conversation, saying that her sins were too public for him to ignore without damaging his own reputation and ability to minister to his congregation. One by one, every door in town closed to her, and she found herself sleeping in the stable behind the inn, paying the stable boy a few precious coins for the privilege of sharing space with the horses and trying to stay warm in the hay that provided minimal protection against the growing cold of approaching winter. The irony was not lost on her that she, who had once been one of the most respectable women in town, was now reduced to seeking shelter among animals, while the community that had once welcomed her turned its back on her suffering. Winter came early that year, arriving with a vengeance that seemed designed to test the resolve of anyone foolish enough to challenge the natural order of things. Dorothy's condition made it increasingly difficult for her to find any kind of work that would provide the income she desperately needed to survive. Her belly grew larger with each passing week, and her movements became more labored and awkward. But she continued to seek employment wherever she could, swallowing her pride and begging for any opportunity to earn a few coins. She offered to do laundry, to clean houses, to tend children, to cook meals, to perform any task that might earn her enough money to buy food and shelter. But no respectable family would hire a woman with her reputation. The scandal had made her untouchable in a community that valued appearances above all else And even those who might have felt sympathy for her situation were unwilling to risk their own social standing by associating with her. The money she had saved during her marriage dwindled to nothing with frightening speed, spent on food and the occasional night's lodging when the cold became too intense to bear. She began to go hungry more often than not, rationing her meager resources and trying to ensure that her unborn child received whatever nourishment she could provide, even as her own body grew weak and thin despite her pregnancy. It was during this time of growing desperation that she first heard the stories about Henry Cooper, tales that were told in hushed voices in the saloon and around fires where men gathered to share news and gossip. The old-timers in the saloon would tell tales of the mountain man who lived high in the peaks, a veteran of the war who had lost his family to disease while he was away fighting for causes that had ultimately meant nothing in the face of personal loss and tragedy. They said he had retreated to the mountains to escape the pain of his losses, building a cabin where no one could find him unless he wanted to be found, creating a sanctuary where he could exist without the constant reminders of what he had lost and what the world had taken from him. Some claimed he was half mad from grief and isolation, driven to the edge of sanity by years of solitude and the weight of memories too painful to bear. Others insisted he was the strongest, most capable man in the territory, someone who had learned to survive and thrive in conditions that would kill lesser men. The stories varied in their details, growing more elaborate with each telling, as stories do when they pass from mouth to mouth through communities hungry for entertainment and distraction. But they all agreed on one fundamental point that gave Dorothy the first spark of hope she had felt in weeks. Henry Cooper was a man who had turned his back on the society that had failed him, and he had no use for the judgments and hypocrisies of civilized people who talked about Christian charity but practiced cruelty and exclusion when it suited their purposes. If anyone might show mercy to a woman cast out by her community, it would be someone who had also been wounded by the cruelties of the world, someone who understood what it meant to be abandoned and rejected by the very people who should have offered support and compassion. Dorothy began to see him as her last hope, a man who might understand what it meant to be abandoned and rejected, who might look past the lies and accusations to see the truth of her situation. As winter deepened and her situation became more desperate with each passing day, as the cold grew more intense and her resources dwindled to almost nothing, Dorothy made the decision that would change her life forever and set her on a path that would either lead to salvation or to death in the wilderness. She would climb the mountain and find Henry Cooper, this legendary figure who might represent her only chance for survival. She had no guarantee that he would help her, no promise that he would even let her speak before sending her away from his sanctuary, no assurance that he was anything more than a figment of imagination created by storytellers with too much time and too little real news to share. But she had exhausted every other option available to her, tried every door and found them all barred against her. The alternative was to die in the cold, along with her unborn child, and she was not ready to surrender to that fate without making one final attempt to save both their lives. The journey up the mountain nearly killed her before she had traveled even half the distance to where she hoped to find Henry Cooper's cabin. She had only a rough idea of where his cabin might be located, based on the vague directions she had gathered from the stories she had heard and the occasional traveler who claimed to have seen smoke rising from the peaks on clear days. The trail was treacherous even for experienced hikers, winding through dense forests where the trees grew so thick that sunlight barely penetrated to the ground, over rocky outcroppings that challenged even the most sure-footed climbers, and through ravines where a single misstep could mean a fall that would end in death on the rocks below. Dorothy was weak from hunger and exhaustion, her body heavy with the child she carried, and every step was an act of will that required her to draw on reserves of strength she had not known she possessed. The pregnancy that had once seemed like a blessing now felt like a burden that might cost both their lives. But she pressed on because the alternative was to give up and die, and something deep inside her refused to accept that fate. She had started the climb with a small pack containing her last few possessions and what little food she could afford to purchase with the final coins she had managed to scrape together. By the second bumpsay, the food was gone and she was surviving on melted snow and the occasional handful of berries she found along the path, food that provided little nourishment, but at least gave her stomach something to work on. Her shoes, which had never been designed for such rough terrain, fell apart on the rocky ground, and she continued barefoot, leaving bloody footprints in the snow that marked her passage like a trail of pain and determination. At night, she huddled under the thin blanket she had brought, shivering in the cold that seemed to penetrate her bones and wondering if she would live to see the sunrise. The sounds of the mountain at night were terrifying to someone accustomed to the relative safety of town life. The howl of wolves in the distance, the crack of branches in the wind, the scurrying of small animals through the underbrush. Every sound seemed to promise danger, and she spent the dark hours fighting against the fear that threatened to overwhelm her resolve. On the third day, when she was beginning to think she might die on the mountain and that her desperate gamble had been nothing more than a slower form of suicide, she saw the smoke rising from a chimney in the distance, a thin gray line against the blue sky that represented hope and the possibility of salvation. The sight gave her the strength to continue, even though her feet were numb with cold and her body was shaking with exhaustion that seemed to have settled into her very bones. She stumbled forward, driven by the desperate hope that she had finally found the man who might save her life, that her suffering and determination had not been in vain. Each step was agony, but each step also brought her closer to what might be her only chance for survival. When she reached the cabin, her strength finally gave out completely, and she collapsed against the porch, unable to take another step, and waited to see if her journey had been in vain or if salvation might actually be within reach. The door opened, and she looked up to see the largest man she had ever encountered, someone who seemed to embody the strength and independence of the mountains themselves. Henry Cooper stood over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and arms that spoke of a lifetime of hard work and physical challenges that would have broken lesser men. His hair was dark with streaks of gray that caught the light, and his eyes were the color of winter sky, cold and distant but not unkind. His face was weathered by years of mountain living, marked by lines that could have been carved by wind and sun, or by the weight of sorrow that he carried like an invisible burden. For a long moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, they looked at each other without speaking, two souls who had been wounded by the world and found themselves face to face in the wilderness. Dorothy saw something in his eyes that she had not expected, a flicker of recognition that went beyond the immediate situation. It was as if he saw himself in her desperation, remembered his own moments of helplessness and abandonment when the world had stripped away everything he valued and left him with nothing but pain and the need to escape. When he spoke, his voice was rough from disuse, the voice of a man who had not had regular conversation with another human being for longer than most people could imagine. But there was kindness in it that surprised them both and gave Dorothy the first real hope she had felt since her world had collapsed around her. Henry lifted Dorothy in his arms with the careful strength of a man who understood fragility and suffering, carrying her into the cabin and kicking the door shut behind him to keep out the cold that had nearly claimed her life during her desperate journey up the mountain. The interior was sparse but clean, furnished with handmade chairs and tables that showed the skill and patience of their creator. A man who had learned to find satisfaction in work done well, even when there was no one to appreciate or acknowledge his efforts. A fire burned in the stone fireplace, filling the room with warmth and the comforting scent of burning pine that spoke of security and shelter from the harsh world outside. He set her down gently in a chair near the fire, positioning her where the heat could begin to restore feeling to her frozen limbs, and began to assess her condition with the practical efficiency of a man who had seen his share of suffering and learned to deal with emergencies without panic or hesitation. "Oh, you are hurt," he said simply, kneeling to examine her feet with the careful attention of someone who understood that small injuries could become life-threatening if not properly treated. The cuts were deep, and some showed signs of infection from the dirt and debris that had worked into the wounds during her long journey through the wilderness. He disappeared into another room and returned with a basin of warm water and clean cloths, setting about the task of cleaning and bandaging her injuries with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with his intimidating appearance and the reputation for wildness that preceded him. Dorothy watched him work, too exhausted and overwhelmed to speak, her mind struggling to process the fact that she had actually found sanctuary after so much suffering and desperation. She had expected many things when she finally found him: rejection, suspicion, demands for explanations she was too tired to give. But not this quiet competence, this matter-of-fact kindness that asked for no explanation or justification and simply responded to need with appropriate action. He worked in silence, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he tended to her wounds with the skill of someone who had learned to be his own doctor and nurse in a place where medical help was days away, even in the best of circumstances. When he finished with her feet, wrapping them in clean bandages that would protect them while they healed, he brought her a cup of hot broth that tasted better than any meal she had ever eaten in her former life of privilege and plenty. A thick blanket followed, which he wrapped around her shoulders before returning to his own chair by the fire, giving her space to recover while remaining close enough to provide help if she needed it. The simple kindness of these gestures moved her more than any grand gesture could have, and she felt tears beginning to flow down her cheeks as the reality of her rescue began to sink in. "Oh, you came a long way," he said finally, his eyes studying her face in the firelight with an intensity that was searching but not judgmental. "The nearest settlement is 20 miles down the mountain, and most of that is rough country that challenges experienced travelers. In your condition, that journey could have killed you easily." "It nearly did," Dorothy admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, still hoarse from the cold and the effort of her climb. "But I had nowhere else to go, no other options left to try. They say you understand what it means to be cast out, to have the world turn against you for things beyond your control. I hope that might make you more willing to help someone in similar circumstances." Henry was quiet for a long time, staring into the flames as if they might hold answers to questions he had not asked in years, memories that he had tried to bury but that still surfaced when he least expected them. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of old pain, carefully controlled, but never entirely forgotten, the kind of grief that becomes part of a person's fundamental character. "I lost my wife and daughter while I was away fighting in a war that was supposed to mean something," he said, his words measured and careful as if he was testing each one before allowing it to escape. Fever took them both in the space of a week while I was thousands of miles away, fighting battles that seemed important at the time, but meant nothing when measured against what I lost. When I came home, the house was empty, and the neighbors looked at me like I was a ghost, someone who should have been there to protect them somehow." He paused, and Dorothy could see the pain in his eyes, the guilt that he carried for circumstances that had been completely beyond his control. "They said I should have been there, should have found a way to come home, as if being thousands of miles away fighting in a war was a choice I made lightly, as if I had abandoned my family for my own pleasure rather than answering a call to duty that every man in the community was expected to honor." Dorothy felt tears on her cheeks, not just for her own situation, but for this man who had carried his grief into the mountains and tried to bury it in isolation, who had been blamed for losses that were no more his fault than her own troubles had been hers. She understood now why he had opened his door to her, why he had looked at her with recognition rather than judgment. They were both refugees from a world that had no place for their pain, both victims of circumstances beyond their control who had been blamed for their own suffering. "Yeah, I am sorry for your loss," she said softly, meaning every word with an intensity that surprised her. "And I am grateful for your kindness, more grateful than I can express. I do not know what I can offer in return, but if you will let me stay until the baby comes, I will work for my keep. I can cook and clean and mend, and I will not be a burden to you. I just need a place to be safe until I can figure out what comes next." Henry looked at her for a long moment, taking in her determination despite her obvious exhaustion, seeing something in her eyes that reminded him of his wife, a strength that had not been broken despite everything she had endured. There was a quality about her that spoke of resilience and character, qualities that he had learned to value above all others during his years of solitude. He made a decision that surprised him with its swiftness and certainty, a choice that felt right in a way that nothing had felt right for years. "You will stay as long as you need to," he said firmly, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had always made those around him feel safe and protected, even in the most difficult circumstances. "This mountain has room for two people running from the world below, and I have learned that isolation is not always the answer to pain. But I want to know your story, all of it, every detail that brought you to my door. If we are going to share this space, there can be no secrets between us, no lies or half-truths that might cause problems later. Dorothy told him everything, from her marriage to Thomas, to the accusations that had destroyed her reputation and left her an outcast in her own community, from her desperate search for work to the journey up the mountain that had nearly cost her life and that of her unborn child. She held nothing back, sharing details that she had never spoken aloud before, truths that were painful but necessary if they were to build any kind of relationship based on honesty and mutual understanding. Henry listened without interruption, his expression growing darker as she described the cruelties she had faced, the systematic way in which her community had turned against her based on lies and gossip rather than facts or evidence. His hands clenched into fists as she described her husband's betrayal and the callous way he had thrown her out into the winter cold, and his jaw tightened with anger at the hypocrisy of people who claimed to be Christians while showing no mercy to someone in desperate need. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time, processing what he had heard and comparing it to his own experiences with the cruelties and injustices of civilized society. Finally, he spoke, and his words carried a conviction that came from hard-earned wisdom and bitter experience. "Your husband is a coward and a fool," he said with quiet intensity, "and your town is full of people who have forgotten what it means to show mercy to those in need, who have replaced compassion with judgment and kindness with cruelty. You are better off away from all of them, and if you choose to stay here, you will never have to face that kind of treatment again." Over the following week, Dorothy slowly recovered her strength under Henry's careful and attentive care, feeling her body healing from the ordeal she had endured and her spirit beginning to mend from the wounds that had been inflicted by those who should have protected her. He was a man of few words, preferring action to empty promises, but his actions spoke volumes about his character and the kind of man he had chosen to become despite the tragedies that had shaped his life. He made sure she had enough to eat, preparing meals that were simple but nourishing, designed to restore her health and provide the nutrition she needed for herself and her growing child. He prepared warm baths to ease her aches and help her recover from the physical toll of her journey, and he never once made her feel like an unwelcome burden or an intrusion into his carefully ordered solitude. In return, she began to take over the household tasks, finding purpose and satisfaction in work that contributed to their shared life in ways that her previous existence as a merchant's wife never had. She cooked meals that were more elaborate and flavorful than the simple fare he had been preparing for himself, bringing variety and pleasure to their daily routine. She mended his clothes with careful stitches that would make them last longer in the harsh mountain environment, and she brought a woman's touch to the stark cabin that transformed it from a mere shelter into something that felt like a home. The work was therapeutic for Dorothy, giving her a sense of purpose and usefulness that she had lost during her months of desperation in town, when every door had been closed to her and every offer of help had been rejected. She found herself looking forward to each day, to the quiet companionship she shared with Henry as they went about their separate tasks, to the peaceful rhythm of life that had nothing to do with social expectations or the opinions of others. He would spend his days hunting, fishing, or working on improvements to the cabin, tasks that required skill and strength, but also provided the satisfaction of work that produced tangible results. Meanwhile, she tended to the household and prepared for the birth of her child, learning skills that would help her contribute to their mountain life, and becoming someone who could take care of herself and others rather than depending on the charity or goodwill of people who might withdraw their support at any moment. As winter deepened and the snow piled higher around their cabin, they settled into a routine that felt surprisingly natural and comfortable for two people who had been strangers just weeks before. Henry had built an additional room onto the cabin, giving Dorothy privacy and space for the baby when it came, working through cold days to ensure that she would have everything she needed when her time arrived. He had also begun to teach her practical skills that would help her survive and thrive in their mountain home, showing her how to preserve meat so it would last through the winter, how to identify edible plants that could supplement their diet, and how to read the signs of changing weather that could mean the difference between life and death in the wilderness. Dorothy found herself changing in ways that went beyond the physical transformation of pregnancy, becoming someone she had never imagined she could be. The woman who had once depended on servants and social position was becoming someone capable and self-reliant, someone who could contribute meaningfully to their shared survival rather than simply existing as a burden to be supported. She discovered strengths she had never known she possessed, and for the first time in her life, she felt truly useful and valued for who she was rather than what she represented or what advantages her position might bring to others. The baby was born on a night in February when the wind howled around the cabin like a living thing, testing the strength of the walls and the warmth of the fire that kept them safe from the brutal cold outside. Henry had assisted with the birth, his steady presence and practical knowledge, helping Dorothy through the long hours of labor that tested her endurance and resolve. When her son finally arrived, healthy and strong despite all the hardships of the pregnancy, Dorothy wept with relief and joy, holding the child who represented not just new life, but new hope for a future she had not dared to imagine. Henry looked down at the tiny child with an expression Dorothy had never seen before, a mixture of wonder and old grief that spoke of memories too painful to share, but too powerful to entirely suppress. When the baby grasped his finger with a tiny fist, something shifted in the mountain man's weathered face, a softening that transformed his features entirely and revealed the gentleness that still existed beneath the protective shell he had built around his heart. "What will you call him?" Henry asked quietly, his voice rough with emotion he was trying to control, the kind of feeling that he had not allowed himself to experience since losing his own family years before. "William," Dorothy said without hesitation, the name coming to her as if it had always been waiting for this moment. "William Wright, after my father. He was a good man who taught me that strength comes from how you treat others, not from how others treat you. He showed me that real character is revealed not in times of comfort and success, but in how we respond to hardship and loss." Henry nodded approvingly, understanding the significance of giving the child a new surname, a fresh start untainted by the circumstances of his birth or the scandals that had driven his mother from her previous life. In that moment, an unspoken agreement passed between them, a commitment that went beyond words or formal promises. This child would grow up knowing only love and acceptance, protected from the judgments and cruelties of the world below, raised by people who understood the value of compassion and the importance of standing by those we love no matter what challenges might arise. As spring arrived and the snow began to melt from the mountain paths, revealing the green world that had been hidden beneath winter's harsh embrace, Dorothy faced a decision that had been weighing on her mind for weeks. The birth of her son had changed everything, giving her a new perspective on her future and her relationship with Henry, forcing her to confront feelings that she had been afraid to acknowledge even to herself. She had grown to love this quiet, gentle man who had saved her life and asked for nothing in return, who had shown her kindness when the rest of the world had turned its back on her suffering. More than that, she had come to realize that she wanted to build a life with him, not out of gratitude or desperation, but out of genuine affection and respect for the man he was and the life they could create together. The question was whether Henry felt the same way about her in their situation. He had been unfailingly kind and protective, treating her with a consideration and respect that she had never experienced even in her marriage, but he had never spoken of love or indicated that he saw her as anything more than a woman in need of shelter and protection. Dorothy feared that his kindness was motivated by duty rather than desire, that he saw her as a responsibility rather than a partner, and the uncertainty tormented her as she tried to imagine what their future might hold. The opportunity to speak her feelings came on a warm May evening when they were sitting on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountain peaks in shades of gold and crimson that took her breath away with their beauty. William was sleeping peacefully in Dorothy's arms, and the world seemed filled with the promise of new beginnings and the possibility of happiness that she had thought was lost to her forever. Dorothy took a deep breath and found the courage to speak the words that had been growing in her heart for months, words that represented both hope and terrible vulnerability. "Henry," she said softly, her voice barely audible above the gentle sounds of evening in the mountains, "I need to tell you something that I have been carrying inside me for weeks now. These months we have spent together have been the happiest of my life, and not just because you saved me from dying on your porch, or because you have given me shelter when I had nowhere else to go." She paused, gathering her courage for what might be the most important words she would ever speak. "It is because you have shown me what it means to be valued for who I am." To be treated with kindness and respect, not because of what I can provide or what advantages I might bring, but simply because I am a human being deserving of compassion. I have come to love you, Henry Cooper, not out of gratitude or desperation, but because you are the best man I have ever known, and I cannot imagine my life without you in it. Henry was quiet for so long that Dorothy began to fear she had made a terrible mistake, that she had misread his kindness and destroyed the peaceful relationship they had built with her presumption and inappropriate feelings. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion that he had been holding back for longer than either of them realized. I have been afraid to hope, he said quietly, his eyes fixed on the distant mountains, as if they might provide the courage he needed to speak words that felt dangerous and precious at the same time. When I lost my family, I thought that part of my life was over forever, that I had used up my allotment of happiness and would spend the rest of my days alone with my memories and my grief. I built this cabin to be a place where I could exist without feeling the pain of what I had lost, where I could go through the motions of living without having to risk caring about anyone or anything again. He turned to look at her then, and Dorothy saw love in his eyes, deep and genuine and patient, the kind of love that had been growing slowly and carefully like a plant taking root in difficult soil. It was the love of a man who had learned to value what truly mattered, who understood that happiness was not something to be taken for granted, but a gift that should be treasured and protected. But you and William have brought something back to life in me that I thought was dead and buried, he continued, his voice growing stronger as he found the words to express feelings that had been too precious and fragile to examine too closely. You have made this house into a home in ways I never thought possible, and you have shown me that it is possible to heal from even the deepest wounds when surrounded by love and acceptance. He reached out and took her hand, his touch gentle but firm, a gesture that spoke of commitment and certainty. I love you, Dorothy Wright, he said simply, using the name she had chosen for her new life, the identity that belonged to this place and this time rather than the painful past she had left behind. I have loved you since the night you collapsed on my porch, not because you needed saving, but because you showed me what real courage looks like. You climbed this mountain when you had every reason to give up, and you have made this isolated place into something beautiful and meaningful. They were married by a traveling preacher who came through the mountains that summer, a man who asked no questions about their past and blessed their union with simple words and genuine warmth. The ceremony was held on their porch with the mountains as witnesses, and Dorothy wore a dress she had sewn herself from fabric Henry had brought back from a trading post, working by candlelight to create something beautiful for the most important day of her new life. She had never felt more beautiful or more loved than she did on that day, standing beside the man who had given her not just shelter, but a new understanding of what marriage could be when built on mutual respect and genuine affection. The vows they spoke were simple but heartfelt, promising to stand by each other through whatever challenges might come, to build a life based on honesty and compassion, and to create a home where love would always triumph over judgment. The years that followed were filled with the quiet joys of mountain life, simple pleasures that meant more to Dorothy than all the luxuries she had known in her previous existence. William grew strong and healthy under Henry's patient guidance, learning to read from the books Henry had collected over the years, and developing the practical skills that would serve him well in their isolated home. He was a bright, curious child who absorbed knowledge like a sponge and showed early signs of the character that would make him exceptional. Dorothy gave birth to two more children, a daughter they named Sarah, and another son they called Michael, and the cabin echoed with the sounds of family life, laughter and conversation, the patter of small feet on wooden floors, and the comfortable noise of people who belonged together. Each birth was easier than the last, and Dorothy marveled at the difference between bringing children into a home filled with love and the fear she had felt when carrying William in circumstances of rejection and desperation. Henry proved to be a devoted father, patient and gentle with the children while teaching them the skills they would need to survive and thrive in their mountain home. He showed William how to track animals and read the signs of the forest, sharing knowledge that had been passed down through generations of men who lived close to the land. He taught Sarah to identify medicinal plants and preserve food for the winter, skills that would make her valuable in any community and capable of taking care of herself and others. With Michael, the youngest, he was especially gentle, perhaps seeing in the boy's eager curiosity an echo of his own lost son. He helped the child develop the strength and coordination that would make him a capable hunter and woodsman. But more importantly, he taught him the values of honesty, hard work, and compassion that would guide him throughout his life. Dorothy flourished in ways she had never imagined possible, transforming from a woman who had been dependent on servants and social position into someone capable of providing for her family in any circumstances. She learned to hunt and fish, skills that Henry taught her with the same patience he showed their children. She became expert at treating injuries and illnesses with herbs and natural remedies, knowledge that proved invaluable not just for her own family, but for the occasional travelers who found their way to the mountain seeking help. Most importantly, she learned to find joy in the simple pleasures of a life lived close to the natural world, the satisfaction of a good harvest from their garden, the warmth of their home on cold winter nights, the laughter of their children as they played in the meadows around their cabin. These were pleasures that money could not buy and that social position could not provide, gifts that came from building a life based on love rather than obligation or convenience. But their peaceful existence was not destined to remain undisturbed forever. As the children grew older and the outside world continued to change and develop, new challenges would test the strength of the family they had built and the love that had sustained them through so many trials and difficulties. The trouble began when William was 12 years old, a bright and curious boy who had begun to ask increasingly sophisticated questions about the world beyond their mountain home. Questions that reflected both his natural intelligence and his growing awareness that there might be opportunities and experiences available to him beyond the boundaries of their isolated sanctuary. He had heard stories from the occasional travelers who passed through their area, tales of towns and cities, schools and universities, opportunities for education and advancement that existed in the valley below and in the wider world beyond. The boy's natural intelligence and eagerness to learn had outgrown what Henry and Dorothy could teach him with their own knowledge and the small collection of books they had accumulated over the years. William was reading at a level far beyond his age, demonstrating an aptitude for mathematics and science that suggested he might be capable of great achievements if given the proper education and opportunities. His questions had become more complex and challenging, touching on subjects that neither of his parents had studied in depth. Dorothy was torn between her desire to give William every opportunity to develop his potential and her deep-seated fear of exposing him to the judgments and cruelties that had driven her to the mountain in the first place. She knew that her past would follow her if she returned to civilization, that people would remember the scandal that had destroyed her first marriage and use it to hurt her children. The thought of subjecting William to that kind of treatment, of having him learn about her supposed sins and the circumstances of his birth, was unbearable and kept her awake at night with worry and dread. But she also worried that keeping him isolated would limit his potential and deny him the chance to make his own choices about his future, that their desire to protect him might ultimately harm him by preventing him from developing the skills and knowledge he would need to succeed in the wider world. It was a dilemma that had no easy answers, and it forced her to confront the possibility that love sometimes required letting go rather than holding on. Henry shared her concerns but approached the problem with his characteristic practicality and his hard-earned wisdom about the nature of change and growth. He had been making periodic trips to the trading posts and settlements to sell the furs and crafts that provided their modest income, and he had observed the changes taking place in the territory with the eye of someone who understood how communities evolved and developed over time. New people were arriving regularly, drawn by opportunities in mining and agriculture, and the old scandals and gossip were being forgotten as communities focused on growth and development rather than dwelling on the past mistakes and misfortunes of their neighbors. The territory was becoming more civilized and tolerant, more focused on practical concerns than on the kind of moral judgments that had made Dorothy's life so difficult years before. "I think it is time," he said one evening as they discussed William's future and the difficult decisions they would have to make. "The boy needs to see the world beyond this mountain, and we need to stop running from a past that no longer has the power to hurt us. You are not the same woman who climbed up here 7 years ago, desperate and broken by circumstances beyond your control. And I am not the same man who carried you inside, bitter and isolated from everything that makes life worth living. He paused, looking at her with the steady gaze that had always made her feel safe and understood. We have built something strong together, something that can withstand whatever challenges the world might throw at us. It is time to trust in that strength and stop letting fear make our decisions for us. The decision to return to civilization was not made lightly, but once it was made, they moved forward with determination and careful planning that reflected their commitment to doing what was best for their children rather than what felt safest for themselves. Henry sold their mountain property to a young couple who were seeking the same kind of isolation and peace that had drawn him there years earlier, passing on their sanctuary to people who would appreciate and protect it. The sale provided them with enough money to purchase a small farm in a growing community 200 miles away, a place where they could start fresh without the burden of old reputations and past mistakes. It was a community that valued hard work and character over social position and gossip, exactly the kind of place where their family could thrive and their children could develop their potential without fear of judgment or discrimination. The journey down from the mountain was emotional for all of them, but especially for Dorothy, who was leaving behind the place where she had found love, safety, and her true self after years of living according to other people's expectations and judgments. As they loaded their belongings onto the wagon Henry had purchased for the trip, she took one last look at the cabin that had been their home for so many years. It looked smaller than she remembered, but it still radiated the warmth and security that had saved her life and given her family a foundation of love and strength that would sustain them no matter where they went or what challenges they might face. The memories they had created there would always be part of them, a source of strength and comfort that no external circumstances could take away. The new community welcomed them without suspicion or judgment, seeing them simply as a hardworking family seeking to build a better life for themselves and their children. Henry's skills as a craftsman and hunter were quickly recognized and valued, making him a sought-after resource for neighbors who needed furniture built, tools repaired, or help with hunting and fishing. His reputation for reliability and fair dealing spread quickly through the community, establishing him as someone who could be trusted and depended upon. Meanwhile, Dorothy's extensive knowledge of herbs and healing, accumulated during their years of mountain living where medical help was days away and self-reliance was essential for survival, made her a sought-after resource for neighbors dealing with illness and injury. She became the person people turned to when the nearest doctor was too far away or too expensive, and her gentle manner and obvious competence earned her the respect and gratitude of families throughout the area. The children adapted to their new surroundings with the resilience of youth and the confidence that came from being raised in a home where they were valued and loved unconditionally. They made friends easily, their mountain upbringing having given them skills and knowledge that impressed their new classmates and teachers. More importantly, they had been raised with values that made them natural leaders and helpers, always ready to assist others and share what they knew. William, now 13 and tall for his age, threw himself into his studies with enthusiasm and determination, quickly distinguishing himself as one of the brightest students the local teacher had ever encountered. His years of learning from Henry and Dorothy had given him a solid foundation in practical skills and critical thinking, while his natural curiosity drove him to explore every subject with passion and dedication that impressed everyone who worked with him. The boy who had been born in a mountain cabin during a blizzard, under circumstances that might have marked him for failure in a less loving environment, was clearly destined for great things. His parents watched his progress with pride and amazement, seeing in his achievements the validation of every sacrifice they had made and every risk they had taken to give him the opportunities he deserved. Sarah, now 10 years old, inherited her mother's strength and her father's practical nature, quickly becoming a leader among the local children and showing an early aptitude for the healing arts that Dorothy had mastered during their mountain years. She was a beautiful child, but more importantly, she was confident and capable, secure in the knowledge that she was loved and valued for who she was, rather than how she looked or what others thought of her. Her teachers noted her exceptional ability to work with younger children, her natural empathy for those who were struggling or in pain, and her obvious intelligence and eagerness to learn. Like her brother, she had been given a foundation of love and security that allowed her to approach new challenges with confidence rather than fear. Michael, the youngest at 8 years old, was a perfect blend of his parents' best qualities, combining Henry's quiet strength with Dorothy's determination and compassion. He was the family diplomat, able to make friends easily and smooth over conflicts with his natural charm and genuine kindness. His teachers noted his exceptional social skills and his ability to bring out the best in his classmates, qualities that suggested he would be successful in whatever field he chose to pursue. Like his siblings, he excelled in school and showed every sign of growing into a remarkable young man who would make meaningful contributions to his community and the world beyond. The foundation of love and security that his parents had provided was evident in his confidence, his kindness, and his natural assumption that the world was a place where good things were possible for those who worked hard and treated others with respect. As the years passed, the family's success in their new community became a source of inspiration for others who had faced their own challenges and setbacks. Dorothy's story, when it became known through the natural process of community building and friendship, was not met with judgment, but with admiration for her courage and determination. She had transformed herself from a victim of circumstances into a strong, capable woman who had built a loving family and contributed meaningfully to her community. People saw in her story proof that it was possible to overcome even the most difficult circumstances, that the past did not have to determine the future, and that love and determination could triumph over judgment and cruelty. Her example inspired other women who were facing their own challenges, showing them that it was possible to build new lives based on their own choices rather than the expectations or limitations imposed by others. Henry, too, found acceptance and respect in their new home, his skills and character earning him a reputation as a man of integrity and reliability who could be counted on to do what he promised and to treat others with fairness and respect. The grief and bitterness that had driven him to the mountains had been replaced by contentment and purpose, and he had become living proof that it was possible to heal from even the deepest wounds when surrounded by love and acceptance. But their greatest test was yet to come, arriving in the form of a letter that reached them on a crisp autumn morning when William was 16 years old and preparing for the next phase of his education. The letter was from Thomas Smith, Dorothy's first husband, who had somehow tracked them down despite their efforts to start fresh in a new place far from their previous life. The letter was brief but threatening, written in the same arrogant tone that Dorothy remembered all too well from the worst days of their marriage. Thomas claimed that William was his legal son and demanded that the boy be returned to him immediately, threatening legal action if his demands were not met within 30 days. He had apparently fallen on hard times since Dorothy's departure, his relationship with Rebecca Miller having ended badly when she discovered his true character, leaving him alone and bitter with no one to blame but himself for the choices he had made. He had convinced himself that claiming William would somehow restore his fortunes and give him a chance to rebuild his life, ignoring the fact that he had rejected the boy before his birth and shown no interest in his welfare for 16 years. The letter revealed a man who had learned nothing from his past mistakes, who still believed that he could manipulate situations and people to serve his own purposes without regard for the damage he might cause. Dorothy's hands shook as she read the letter, memories of her first marriage flooding back with painful clarity that brought back all the fear and helplessness she had felt during those terrible months when her world had collapsed around her. She had thought that chapter of her life was closed forever, that the distance and time would protect her family from the man who had caused her so much pain and who had shown himself capable of such cruelty. The idea that Thomas might try to take William away from the only father he had ever known, from the family that had loved and nurtured him since birth, filled her with a terror she had not felt since her desperate climb up the mountain all those years ago. It was the kind of fear that threatened to paralyze her, to take her back to the helpless woman she had been before Henry had shown what she was capable of becoming. Henry read the letter with growing anger, his jaw tightening as he absorbed the implications of Thomas's threats and the arrogance of a man who thought he could simply claim a child he had rejected and tear apart a family he had never bothered to understand. It was exactly the kind of behavior Henry had come to expect from the civilized world that had disappointed him so many times before. Proof that some people never learn from their mistakes or develop the capacity for genuine remorse. He will not take our son, Henry said firmly, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had always made Dorothy feel safe and protected, the strength that had sustained them through every challenge they had faced together. William belongs with us, with the family that raised him and loved him from the moment he drew his first breath. No court in the territory would give custody to a man who abandoned his pregnant wife and denied paternity of the child. But Dorothy knew that the law was not always just, especially when it came to the rights of women and children in a society that still favored men in most legal disputes. Thomas had money and connections that they lacked, resources he could use to hire expensive lawyers and influence judges. He was skilled at manipulating situations to his advantage, at presenting himself as the victim rather than the perpetrator of cruelty. The thought of having to fight for her son in court, of having their private lives exposed to public scrutiny and judgment, filled her with dread. She imagined William learning the details of his birth, discovering the accusations that had been made against her, having to defend his own legitimacy and his right to the family that had raised him with such love and care. William himself was devastated by the news, unable to understand how a stranger could claim the right to disrupt the only life he had ever known. He had grown into a confident, capable young man under Henry's guidance, excelling in his studies and preparing for a future that seemed bright with possibility. The idea that his biological father might force him to abandon his family and his dreams was incomprehensible and terrifying. "I do not understand," he said, his voice shaking with emotion as he struggled to process what was happening. "Henry is my father. You are my mother. This man is nothing to me, less than nothing. How can he have any claim on my life when he has never been part of it?" "We need to be prepared for a legal battle," Henry said after they had discussed their options and considered every possible response to Thomas's threats. "I will hire the best lawyer in the territory, and we will fight this with everything we have. Thomas Smith may think he can intimidate us, but he has no idea what he is dealing with. We are not the same people we were when Dorothy left Cedar Falls. We have built something strong together, and we will not let him destroy it." The legal proceedings that followed were long and difficult, testing the family's strength and unity in ways they had never imagined possible. Thomas arrived in town with a lawyer who specialized in family law, a man with a reputation for winning cases through intimidation and manipulation rather than justice. He was confident that his biological claim to William would be enough to win custody, and he painted himself as a reformed man who had made mistakes in his youth, but now wanted to make amends by providing his son with opportunities and advantages that a simple farming family could never offer. He hired private investigators to dig into Henry and Dorothy's past, looking for anything that might be used to discredit them as parents or to support his claim that William would be better off in his custody. He spread rumors through the community, trying to turn public opinion against them and create doubt about their fitness as parents. It was a campaign of character assassination that reminded Dorothy of the worst days in Cedar Falls, when lies and gossip had destroyed her reputation and left her with nowhere to turn. But Henry and Dorothy had allies that Thomas had not counted on, people who had seen their character demonstrated through years of consistent behavior and genuine contribution to their community. The community that had welcomed them and watched their children grow was not willing to see the family torn apart by the greed and manipulation of a stranger who had never shown any interest in William's welfare before it became convenient for his own purposes. Neighbors testified to Henry's character as a father and provider, speaking of his patience with the children, his dedication to their education and development, and his obvious love for all three of them. They told stories of how he had helped other families in times of crisis, how he had shared his skills and knowledge freely, and how he had earned the respect of everyone who knew him through his consistent demonstration of integrity and reliability. Teachers spoke of William's achievements and the loving support he had received from his parents, describing a boy who was confident, capable, and clearly thriving under their care. They noted his exceptional academic performance, his leadership qualities, and his obvious security in his family relationships. The local doctor who had worked with Dorothy on numerous medical cases praised her skills and dedication to helping others, describing her as one of the most capable and compassionate people he had ever known. Most importantly, William himself was old enough to have a voice in the proceedings, and his testimony was perhaps the most powerful evidence in their favor. When called to testify, he spoke with the quiet dignity he had learned from Henry and the strength he had inherited from Dorothy, demonstrating the character and maturity that were the direct result of their loving guidance. "I do not know Thomas Smith," William said simply. his voice clear and steady as he addressed the court. "He may have contributed to my biological existence, but Henry Cooper is my father in every way that matters. He is the man who taught me to hunt and fish, who stayed up all night when I was sick with fever, who encouraged my dreams and supported my education even when it meant sacrifices for the family." He paused, looking directly at the judge with the confidence of a young man who knew exactly where he belonged. "Dorothy Cooper is my mother, the woman who gave me life and love, who showed me what it means to be strong in the face of adversity, who taught me that family is defined by choice and commitment rather than biology alone. They are my family, and I choose to stay with them. No court order could make me accept Thomas Smith as my father, because that role is already filled by a man who has earned it through 16 years of devoted care." The judge, a fair-minded man who had been watching the proceedings with growing distaste for Thomas's obvious opportunism and manipulation, made his decision quickly and decisively. He ruled that William would remain with the family that had raised him, noting that the best interests of the child were clearly served by staying with parents who had demonstrated their love and commitment through years of devoted care and sacrifice. This court recognizes that families are built through love and commitment rather than biology alone, the judge stated in his ruling. "The evidence clearly shows that William Cooper has been raised by parents who have provided him with love, education, moral guidance, and every opportunity to develop his potential. Mr. Smith's claim, based solely on biological connection and made after 16 years of complete absence from the child's life, has no merit in law or justice." Thomas left town that same day, defeated and humiliated, his dreams of easy money and restored fortunes shattered by the reality of a legal system that occasionally worked as it should. His lawyer, recognizing that any appeal would be futile and would only result in additional legal fees that Thomas could not afford, advised him to accept the decision and move on with his life. He never contacted the family again, disappearing back into whatever life he had built for himself after destroying his first marriage. The victory was sweet, but more than that, it was a confirmation of everything Henry and Dorothy had built together over the years of their marriage. Their love had created a family strong enough to withstand any challenge, and their children had grown into remarkable young people who would carry forward the values of courage, compassion, and integrity that had sustained them through so many trials and difficulties. William went on to become a doctor, using the healing knowledge he had learned from his mother and the strength of character he had developed under his father's guidance to help others and make meaningful contributions to his community. He established a practice that served both the wealthy and the poor with equal dedication, never forgetting the lessons about compassion and service that had been instilled in him from childhood. Sarah became a teacher, sharing her love of learning with children who needed the same kind of encouragement and support that had shaped her own childhood and development. She specialized in working with children from difficult backgrounds, using her own family's story as proof that circumstances of birth do not determine destiny and that love and determination can overcome almost any obstacle. Michael followed in Henry's footsteps as a craftsman and outdoorsman, building a reputation for skill and reliability that honored the man who had raised him and taught him the value of work done well. He also became a guide for travelers and settlers, using his knowledge of the wilderness to help others find their way safely through the challenges of frontier life. Dorothy and Henry aged gracefully together, surrounded by children and grandchildren who carried forward the legacy of love and resilience from his that had begun with a desperate woman's climb up a mountain and a lonely man's decision to open his door to someone in need. They had proven that families are not defined by blood alone, but by the choices we make and the love we share, by the commitment to stand by each other through good times and bad. The woman who had once collapsed on a stranger's porch, begging for mercy and expecting nothing but rejection, had found something far more valuable than charity or temporary shelter. She had found home, and in finding it, she had helped create a legacy that would endure for generations to come, a testament to the power of love to transform lives and create meaning from even the most difficult circumstances. Their story became part of the local folklore, told and retold as an example of how courage and compassion could triumph over cruelty and judgment, how two broken people could heal each other and build something beautiful from the wreckage of their past disappointments. It was a story that gave hope to others facing their own challenges, proof that no situation is so desperate that it cannot be redeemed by love and determination.